All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session for Prince George's County on rent stabilization. This is the first of probably many discussions we will have over the next year about this topic. My name is Angie Rogers. I am the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for economic development for Prince George's County. And as many of you know, earlier this year, the Prince George's County Council passed CB7, which is a rent stabilization bill for the county, setting a cap on, in most circumstances, the extent to which rents can increase in rental properties in Prince George's County. They further later passed CB 51, which was an emergency act concerning landlord retaliation for rent stabilization. So we are, as a result, convening a work group in the county, jointly convened by the Office of the County Executive and the council, represented by Councilmember Crystal Oriata, convening a work group to begin to delve into this topic of rent stabilization with the intention of devising a permanent rent stabilization law for Prince George's County. That work group is going to officially begin its work later in the month of July. Before the work group begins its work, we are convening this series of fact-finding sessions in order to just put a base level of information on the table for us to consider, to give the work group a chance to start to think about the things that they want to tackle as a work group. And because there is so much work that's been done around the country on this, because we are not the first community to grapple with this issue, we wanted to have this series of sessions to really allow us to begin to dig into this topic. We are planning 3 fact-finding sessions. This first one is on local and national research, starting to look at what some of the other practices out there look like. We will also have another session on July 12th that will be focused on tenant impact, and a third session on July 13th that will be focused on landlord and developer impact. Today, we have with us 2 presenters who have been looking at this issue for much longer than I have. And so we are excited to have them here today. We have Tina Stacy from the Urban Institute, who has done an impressive amount of research on this issue and is going to share some of that with us. And we also have Stephanie Brown from the Urban Land Institute, Minnesota, who will talk about that, the Minneapolis community's experience grappling with this issue as well. So just a reminder for our work group members, we'd like for you to stay off video and on mute unless we get to the point where you want to ask a question. Then you can come on video and come off mute. You can also put questions in the Q&A. You can put things in the chat. For the members of the public who are joining us, if you are joining us as an attendee, please put your questions in the Q&A if you have them. And we're going to do our best to get through our time efficiently today and hopefully answer all that we can. But remember, this is the first conversation of many that we're going to have over the next year. We're not going to be able to tackle everything today. We are going to probably create an impressive body of work over the next year around this issue as it relates to Prince George's County. And so if we don't get to your topic today, we'll certainly try and take it up as the work group continues its work. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Tina and Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Angie. I'm going to share my screen. Can y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Like Angie mentioned, my name is Tina Stacy, and I'm an economist at the Urban Institute. You've got Urban Institute and Urban Land Institute here, which are often mixed up. So apologies for that. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Institute, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit research organization located in Washington, D.C. And our mission really is to provide rigorous evidence and data to help support policy and practice decisions. And I will let Stephanie introduce herself as well, and then we'll dive in.
Oops. Yeah, Stephanie Brown. I'm the executive director of ULI, it's Urban Land Institute in Minnesota specifically. We are also a nonprofit education organization, but we are more focused on practitioners than the sort of robust research and data work that Tina does. So we do a mix of technical assistance for cities, professional development, as well as a certain level of research and data reports and so on and so forth, focused on everything that touches the built environment. And then as Angie referenced, I got brought into this partly because Minnesota and both St. Paul and Minneapolis, there are very robust conversations going on in the past few years and policies around rent stabilization. And so we've been delving in pretty deep there. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Stephanie. We're so lucky to have Stephanie because, you know, while we do research, she's really been on the ground in the middle of this, so has so much knowledge to share and lessons from that work. So we're just going to start with very basic overview ABCs. What are we talking about when we say rent stabilization or rent control? So generally, rent control is a loose term used to cover a broad spectrum of rent regulations. And you'll see people use these terms interchangeably. The rent control can vary from these hard caps on maximum rents. So this was kind of the older, more traditional rent control that you saw, you know, with a very like a strict cap on rents, the actual dollar amount that rents could be. Or they can be limits on the amount that rent can increase over time. These were first implemented in the US during World War II as a hard ceiling on rents, like I mentioned, and those are usually referred to as kind of the more traditional rent control. And it's evolved over time into a less stringent and more nuanced regulatory scheme, which we're going to be talking about today. And this is generally referred to as rent stabilization. But again, you'll hear people use these terms interchangeably. So these modern rent stabilization programs generally involve a cap on annual rent increases, along with a set of accompanying regulations, such as vacancy decontrol, condominium conversion regulations, hardship clauses, and exemptions based on building type and age. And we're going to go into detail in each one of these. But these are kind of things that have been added on over time to help with loopholes and unintended consequences of those older rent control policies. So the current state of rent stabilization, get this great map from National Multifamily Housing Coalition or Council. We know that as of 2022, there were 7 states and the District of Columbia that had localities in which some form of residential rent stabilization was in effect, right? California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Maine, Oregon, and Minnesota. 37 states either prohibit or preempt rent stabilization, and 7 states allow their cities to enact rent stabilization, but have no cities that have implemented it. So there's a lot of states that preempt it. So we started our work on rent stabilization, just talking to people, right? Doing interviews with developers, landlords, renters, tenant organizers, all sorts of different folks. And we found diverging viewpoints about the efficacy of rent stabilization, as you could imagine, right? So we heard that many landlords, for-profit developers, and real estate industry representatives were skeptical of rent stabilization's ability to provide affordable housing for renters with low income and renters of color, while many tenant advocates and housing policy researchers felt that policy loopholes or weak regulatory coverage were really to blame when rent stabilization failed to improve housing affordability. But what has the research said? I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize a broad body of research. I will say that most of the research up until now on rent stabilization, one was on kind of older policies, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that generally had stronger exemptions for new development than they do now, new construction. But also a lot of these older studies were on one city at a time, and rent stabilization varies so much from city to city. So to kind of get an overall, how does it work on average across places is really hard because it's so different, and we're gonna get into that. But overall, so far, the research has generally said that although rent stabilization has been shown to increase stability and affordability for tenants in controlled units, some studies have found that these benefits are offset by greater costs in the uncontrolled rental market because of reductions in the overall supply of rental units, meaning that, you know, if you're lucky enough to be in a rent controlled unit, you're going to benefit from it. But depending on how the regulation is designed, if it is designed in a way that does discourage overall development or makes rental units leave the market, then you might get a supply effect that offsets those benefits. So you really have to design this in a thoughtful way, balancing those two, the benefits and the unintended costs, right? And critics have also questioned whether these benefits truly reach renters with low income and renters of color who face the greatest affordability challenges, since usually rent stabilization is not means tested, meaning that anyone of any income can live in a rent stabilized unit. So it's just another thing to keep in mind. You know, there are ways to design a regulation in a way that really attempts to target the benefits to people with lower incomes and people of color, and ways of discouraging landlords from only accepting tenants that are higher income or are more likely to move, like students, young students, and things like that, which we will get into as well.
I'll jump in on that point.
Definitely
When
jump in.
Tina talks about on both of these, really talks about the research on past policies, it's important to be honest about the limits of that research because we looked typically at a certain era of policies that had certain features, and there is a new era of policies coming that have tended to go in one of two directions. They have either tried to respond to some of the flaws of the past model by really loosening it up. So this is the rent control that Oregon passed, which was a statewide rent control that had a higher cap, less additional inflation. Or they've tried to correct for those flaws by sort of regulating out areas that had felt like loopholes in the past, which is the first thing that St. Paul passed, which we'll talk about as well. So we're in this shifting era of what we really think the policies will do, and people are trying to learn from the research and make corrections, but there's a limit to what we actually know and can do. And we're going to have to all sort of walk through some of that uncertainty together in different jurisdictions and see what we learn and continue to adjust. So there will be questions that you want to be able to look to the research and get an answer to, and just won't be possible because of the constraints of what exists. So one of the questions, and we'll talk about it, comes up a lot is, does rent control hurt new construction? Well, every old rent control policy exempted new construction. So it's really hard to answer that question about what the consequences are if you don't exempt. There are theories, but the data is loose. So just be aware of that as we talk about this. On the other question, and who rent control is directed to, it's really important to figure out what is the purpose of different policies. And I think there is a fair bit of consensus that rent stabilization, rent control policies do not create additional affordable housing. They can, at least for some people, slow the pace of rent increases. But if the rents were already high for everyone, it's not going to suddenly make them lower. It's not intended to suddenly make them lower. So walking through that, what is possible with this policy? What is the problem we're seeing? Is this policy the right one to address? Do I need multiple policies at once? All of that is really important. So I wish there were simple answers. My own perspectives on what these policies should look like has continued to evolve as I've seen different models and explored different things. But those are two things to be aware of. There are limits to the existing data and research, and there are real nuances, not only in design, but in the goal and the outcome of different types of policies. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a perfect segue into the next slide, which is the big takeaway, I think so far, and what the research has shown and what Stephanie's talking about is that it really matters how these laws are designed, how these policies are designed, right? And so we're gonna start getting into the nitty gritty of that. Like, what are the different components and why do they matter? So the major rent stabilization policy components that we're going to show here, these could be framed in many different ways, but there's the choice of the cap. So how much the rent can increase over time. And we'll talk about these in detail one by one. There's exceptions to those limits on increase, right? For instance, a landlord can get an exception to that cap on an increase if they, for instance, upgrade the home or make some repairs. We'll talk about those. There are exemptions, which is which buildings are exempted from rent control regulations and which ones are included in it. There's vacancy decontrol, which we'll talk about again in more detail. It is generally vacancy decontrol is a policy that means that when a tenant moves out, the landlord can then pop the rent up, maybe to market rate or maybe some percentage of market rate, which does create some perverse incentives, right, for landlords to push tenants out. So we're going to talk about that. And then almost just as important as how the policy is designed is how it's enforced. So compliance and education. Are you investing enough money in actually overseeing this? Are you educating people about their rights? And are you tracking and monitoring these data, right, and enforcing it? And Stephanie, again, jump in at any time. And if anyone has any questions, please jump in. So we'll start with the big one of what most people think of with rent stabilization is what is that cap or that permanent rent increase and how are you going to set that, right? So there are a couple of different ways. They can be set using a fixed formula determined by a state or local housing agency, or it can be determined each year or in some other interval by a rent stabilization board. Now, places that have boards, some people see that there are benefits to that and that the board can adjust based on the needs of the time. However, if you look back over time at places that do have rent stabilization boards, you can see those allowable increases varying more based on politics than on like the economy or other issues in some places. So there are some risks to using a rent stabilization board rather than having a fixed rate every year. There's also uncertainty that you add into the market if you have a board rather than a fixed rate. So programs with formula-based rent increases, they use a few common methods to set their increases, such as, but not limited to, the following. You could set the rent allowable increases equal to the full amount of the annual consumer price index or some other flat percentage, 5%, whatever makes sense. You could set it equal to a percentage of the annual CPI, so a percent of CPI, or you can set it based on the cost of living throughout the duration of a lease. More complicated, but perhaps in some ways better for both the tenant and the landlord. And then there are also anti-gouging limits, which just set a high max rent increase cap to really ensure that there's no gouging going on. You will see that some people call their rent stabilization policies anti-gouging. So this term can be used in multiple ways, but that is one way to term it. Stephanie, did you have anything to add here? I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so I think this gets a lot of attention as the sort of easy high level number. When I go through the St. Paul policy, the original and the revised, you'll see the high level numbers stayed the same, but the policy is radically different and feels radically different because of the nuances behind it. So I'd caution how much you sort of index on a single number when thinking about the design of this policy. The other thing to keep in mind is we'll talk about implementation and enforcement, but how complex this number is has a real impact on enforcement. So if people don't know what CPI is, they either don't know what the term is, or they don't know how to find the number, or why would they, then it's really hard to know if your landlord sort of honored that increase or not from a tenant perspective. And if enforcement is a burden that you feel, then complexity is hard. The places, in Berkeley is one of the jurisdictions that what they do is they actually calculate on a unit by unit level. Well, that takes an incredible amount of staff time and budget to administer, but it also means a letter gets sent to the landlord and to the tenant, so the rent can be this year. So it's very clear from a user perspective, but very complex from a jurisdiction perspective. So it's sort of understanding the interplay between these different aspects that is really quite important. The other thing I would say is the framework that we just introduced was from a study that was done for Minneapolis by the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. It's a really great study in many ways, and I love this framework. I think one of my personal critiques of it and how this gets talked about often is it tends to look over very long periods of time for averages. What are sort of rent increases on average? And so I can't remember if it was 10 or 20 years that on average rents have gone up 2.7%. So a 3% cap wouldn't really sort of impact that, is the general sense. But averages can obscure really important differences within units and within years. And we have a tendency to think that whatever economic moment we're in is a perpetual economic moment. We're in high inflation. And so putting something to inflation means that rents can just keep going up and up and up and up, huge numbers. Well, inflation isn't always there. So you just got to kind of think through if this policy had been in place, 20 years ago, what would that have felt like 10 years ago, and think through some different economic eras when you think about setting caps.
Such a great point. Lots of great points. So like Stephanie said, that's really just one component of a rent control regulation. It's the one that people mostly focus on, but there's so many other important components as well. So one is the exception to rent caps, right? How are there going to be scenarios in which you say, okay, landlord, you are overseeing a rent controlled unit, but we're going to give you an exception to your permitted increase this year. So a lot of places allow cost pass-throughs for maintenance or capital improvements. And the main goal of this is really to address property quality and maintenance concerns, right? There have been some concerns that maybe rent controlled units are going to be upgraded less because they're not getting as much rent. And so allowing these pass-throughs for maintenance improvements and quality updates can supposedly help alleviate that. But on the other hand, some tenant advocates argue that these improvements and subsequent pass-throughs can be unnecessary and overburden tenants, right? So a landlord might do an improvement that isn't necessary just to increase the rent or get a tenant to leave, right? So I think, again, there are more details that could be gone into here that we don't go into in this presentation, but there are some ways that places have really thought through those unintended consequences and misaligned incentives to try to think of ways to make that work. There are also often right to fair return components of these, where landlords can file a hardship petition seeking approval to raise rents over the standard permitted increase, typically calculated as a measure of income of that the property generates against the approved operating costs and valuation. So for instance, in DC, landlords can file a petition if they earn anything less than a 12% rate of return on their investment property. And then this is also related to what we're going to get to in a moment on vacancy decontrol. But there are some places that are using allowing for banked increases, right? So, and Stephanie can explain this better than me, but so say I'm a landlord and I really like my tenant and I don't want to increase their rent to the maximum that's allowed this year because I want to keep them and I really don't need to. But I know that if I don't do that this year, I'm going to lose all that money perpetually into the future because each year it's a % increase. So in order to allow them to have that lower increase in 1 year, some places allow landlords to bank those percentage increases so that when that tenant moves out or when they decide they need to increase it, they can increase it to the full amount of all those banked increases. And Stephanie, I don't know if you have more to add there.
I think you explained that concept really well. I think my other addition to this whole piece would be definitions matter. So right of fair return, reasonable return, I think how we've been referring to it, that has to be actually defined what that means or doesn't mean if you want to enforce it. And that is tricky. Other pass-throughs that I've seen specifically call out involve taxes and tax increases, particularly when you are in a place where the values of homes are increasing quickly and the assessed value or the appraised value of a home is going up, and then the taxes on it can increase dramatically. So you just want to make sure that there is effectively what you're trying to monitor here is to make sure that people don't just want to get out of the business of being landlords entirely, particularly smaller landlords who might be, I mean, they probably are, right? They're residents in your community as well. They are voters, they're stakeholders, and generally those are not the landlords people are worried about when they are looking for rent stabilization. It's often outside investors, bigger firms that are just sort of looking a little more at spreadsheets, and smaller landlords often know their tenants a little more. And you want those landlords to still feel like this is something that they can do, that the return and the risk don't get so out of whack that everything is owned by a real estate investment trust that doesn't have that same sort of connection. So that's some of the balance that you're looking for here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I always like to try to remind myself as well that, I feel like in the US sometimes tend to think of landlords as these big conglomerate organizations, but the majority of landlords in the US are small landlords, right? And so we want to make sure that we're not putting them out of business either unfairly. So that kind of also gets into the exemptions and defining the rent controlled stock. So which buildings are going to be, you have to decide when you're designing this regulation, which buildings are going to be exempt from rent control and which ones are going to be have to follow those rent control regulations. So most rent stabilization policies exempt new construction, as we mentioned earlier. Older regulations generally tended to say anything built before 1970 is subject to rent control, anything after is not. Well, what that means is over time, your rent controlled stock continues to decline until it's gone, right? So then other places have put in rolling exemptions. So 5, 10, 15, 20 years after construction, that's when you become rent stabilized. And like Stephanie mentioned in the beginning, we don't know what effect that will have on new construction, right? There's really no great research showing whether those shorter exemptions or rolling exemptions for rent control do affect new construction in a place. Some places, like I mentioned, exempt building construction constructed after a certain date or offer a grace period like we're talking about before it's incorporated into the controlled stock. They generally also exclude small buildings and single family homes for the reasons Stephanie was just mentioning. But this can raise equity concerns, right? So single family homes have become an increasingly larger share of the rental housing stock, particularly in racially diverse neighborhoods. And their tenants are more likely to have children living in poverty. So thinking about whether you want to exempt all single family homes is certainly, I think, something that should be considered. And some large landlords own many small units, right? Allowing them to evade rent stabilization regulations. So some places have come up with solutions to this, like in DC, where they use an alternative approach that bases coverage on the size of the owner's portfolio rather than on the number of units within a building. And California's 2019 Tenant Protection Act differentiates between small landlords and investors by ensuring that real estate investment trusts and corporate owners of single family rentals are included in the coverage. So thinking about some of those really nuanced ways to ensure that you're getting those positive benefits without those negative unintended consequences. Anything to add, Steph?
Yeah, two things. One of the questions in the chat was around sort of, is there a time limit on how long people benefit? Generally, there is not. There can be a timeline on when buildings are impacted, and that's how this factors in, but it's not, it doesn't expire as much as there can be ways to sort of take your building out, depending on the policies. But the bigger time question is this new construction question. I just want to talk a little bit about why that matters. So one, why new construction matters is the population continues to grow, buildings fall into disrepair, buildings get taken down. If you think about just our recent experience with the Great Recession, I know I can say in Minnesota, we suddenly went from 2007 to 2009, we were building only a quarter of the homes we were building before, right? And so new construction really dried up. We suddenly weren't making as much housing. And we have been trying to climb out of that hole for a while, making sure there is enough homes to go around, because when there's a lot of competition, when there are low vacancy rates, when houses don't stay on the market long, whether you are looking to rent or looking to buy, that is part of what drives up prices. And so that supply question matters. The reason there's a conversation around exempting new construction is when you're building new housing, you are trying to attract money into the market to invest in that property so that you can secure it enough to get a loan. And investors, which can be pension funds and mutual funds, they're also not necessarily faceless bankers, as things get phrased. They look at these sorts of risks. And so it can be harder to get investors to build buildings in your area if investors are skeptical because of rent control policies. So if it dries up the money, even if there is demand for the housing, it gets much harder to build. And the reason that time window is there is it takes a while for a building to what we call stabilize. So it takes a while for the building to lease up so that it is a full, or whatever a sort of healthy level of full is. And buildings tend to move a little more in how they price their rents at the beginning as they try to correctly judge the market that they are renting to. So when you build a building, you think you should be able to rent out for a certain amount, and you build your whole financing model around that. But you don't really know until you figure out whether or not people lease the building. And so some additional flexibility in those early years allows you to make sure you're able to get the initial rents and adjust, because sometimes you thought the market was going to be a certain way, and then something like COVID happens and everything changes, and you suddenly can't rent that building out for what you thought you could when you put the proposal in. And so the reason there is a time component to this new construction exemption is because it takes a while for buildings to sort of steady into what they rent out for. And you want investors to not be scared to invest in your market in a way that tightens housing supply. And like we said before, a lot of this is how people talk and think and how we understand markets to work. It is not research based on a specific policy, but certainly as I have talked to people about how they perceive our market in Minneapolis, St. Paul, since rent control, it is a real and present conversation. Back to you.
Thanks. And I was just going to answer a question in the chat as well, whether there are exemptions for subsidized housing. Yes, usually subsidized housing is exempt from rent regulations. Okay, so I don't think, did I miss one? No. The next big topic that gets discussed a lot is this issue of vacancy decontrol, or maybe not discussed enough. Most places allow what we call vacancy decontrol, which is when a tenant leaves a unit, when they move out for whatever reason, the landlord is able to pop the rent up to market rate or to some other percentage of that, or it can exclude units from regulation after a vacancy. So like really completely remove them from the rent controlled stock. So this creates a weird incentive, right, for landlords to displace current residents and encourages them to select tenants who are more mobile and often have higher incomes, right? I interviewed a small landlord in California who straight up told me that he tries to get students because he knows that they'll leave, right? And so, this does create this perverse incentive. And we know that, so a lot of cities have kind of implemented tenant protections, eviction protections on top of rent control and vacancy decontrol to kind of try to counteract this. But unfortunately, there are a lot of informal ways that landlords can get tenants to leave, right? They can not fix issues. They can be aggressive or unfriendly. There are a lot of ways that you can get someone out without evicting them. So I think this is something really to consider and think about. Studies have also shown that cities with vacancy decontrol, or places where stabilization remains in place at the same level, even after a tenant is replaced, they experience an increase in their share of Black and Latino renters, and were generally more affordable to low-income households. Conversely, jurisdictions with vacancy decontrol were less affordable and disproportionately displaced Black renters. Oh, and there's the quote at the bottom that the small landlord in California said to us, we like students. Number one, they leave. I always raise the rents to market rates when they leave. The best tenants are the people that pay the most. So just something to really think about. Do you want to have vacancy decontrol, and do your accompanying tenant protections really counteract those misincentives? Stephanie, anything to add on this important?
Yeah, I'll just point back to the sort of rent increase banking that Tina mentioned earlier as one way to navigate this, because I think Tina just walked through all the risks of decontrol in terms of incentivizing people to leave, and the fact that sort of units, suddenly you're not really stabilizing rents, or you aren't for the overall market, just for individual tenants. The flip side risk is if landlords know that they're only going to be able to increase by a certain amount, they're going to increase by that amount. Maybe not everyone all the time, but a lot of times if there's a stable tenant, it costs money to find someone new, to repair an apartment in between, and people would rather keep that tenant and maybe not raise rents. But we saw a number of owners who increased rents to the maximum amount across their entire portfolio. Including nonprofit housing providers, right? And we're talking good actors who were still like, I know I'm gonna have cost, and so I'm gonna max out all of my rent increases. And so you're trying to toe a line between those two different ways this can backfire.
Yes, it's a great way to put it. Okay, and like I mentioned, a lot of places do institute tenant protections on top if you don't already have them, either as part of the rent stabilization policy or as just a separate one for all units. Many places have enacted, just cause eviction requirements to mitigate the negative impacts of vacancy decontrol. However, research and key stakeholders with whom we spoke said that landlords find so many loopholes around these protections that vacancy control may be the only way to really protect units, the stability of tenants in rent controlled units. But again, this is something for you all to decide. And this is getting at what I said earlier, the landlord doesn't have to evict them. They can just choose not to renew their lease if they think somebody else will come in and pay more. So there's lots of informal eviction methods that are used. And then enforcement and implementation, and Stephanie has a lot of thoughts, great input on this, is that enforcement and implementation are just as, if not more important, right, as policy design choices. So have you invested enough money in enforcement and oversight? Do you have enough staff to oversee it? What data are you going to be using to track it and monitor it? And do you have the money and staff to be doing that as well? And how will tenants and landlords hear and become educated about the policy? Like Stephanie mentioned, there are places where the city or county or whoever does all the administrative oversight to inform tenants and landlords about how much their rents are able to increase, which is great. That's a lot of administrative costs. So if you're not going to do that, how are you going to make sure that tenants, particularly your most vulnerable tenants, know about their rights and are ensuring that those rights are being enforced, right? And these decisions can have just as much of an impact on policy outcomes as regulatory design choices. Stephanie, you want to add in here?
I think the enforcement burden really matters here. And what I mean by enforcement burden is, who is the one that raises the flag that says something is off? Because what we see across all different systems in this country is that the more money you have, the more education you have, the wider your household is, the more effective you are on large to navigate systems. And so if you have a rent control policy, but it is complicated, it is not well publicized, it is hard to understand, and the only person who can point to the fact that something is off is a tenant a renter who is working multiple jobs, a single parent, not spending a lot of time in public meetings and reading, paying for a newspaper subscription. Are they even going to know that their landlord, these are the people you're trying to protect, are they even going to know when their landlord messed it up? And are they going to have the resources and the time to pursue and challenge what the landlord did? So in order for the policy to reach the people who are most vulnerable, it has to be accessible, and the full burden of carrying that probably shouldn't be on them. So there have to be resources to help people pursue challenges to raise where there is something wrong and possibly some oversight that doesn't rely on that. So that enforcement burden is something that I think can be pretty overlooked.
Yes, great points. And then here's your case study for St. Paul.
Yeah, so we don't want to treat all of these as completely independent variables, right? They talk to each other and they mean different things. So our process here is a little odd because we are both one of those places where the state says no rent control is allowed, and where we have two jurisdictions who did, Minneapolis and St. Paul, that did voter referendums to authorize charter amendments that were sort of a workaround to that preemption. Minneapolis does not have a policy. We authorize the council to pursue a policy, and it is fiercely debated right now. St. Paul voters passed by referendum a specific policy in 2021. There was then a work group, very similar process to what you guys are doing right now, that spent a lot of time working through different options, made recommendations to council, and then council, through a public hearings process and a number of other things, ultimately chose to amend that policy to what we have now, or what is about to go into effect. So they are very different policies. The first version was it was considered to be the strictest form of rent control in the country when it was passed. It was a 3% cap. There were no exceptions. So it included single family, it included affordable housing, it included new construction. There were 7 different types of exemptions that were mentioned, for things that could be pass-throughs, capital improvements, property taxes, and it mentioned a reasonable return. There was no vacancy decontrol as part of this, and the compliance and education was sort of like, the city will figure this out. And so the city was then quickly expected to enforce a policy that they hadn't sort of built a regime around. And so part of how they did that the first year was to, and they've actually continued this, but to allow property owners to apply for an up to 8% increase to sort of self-certify that balance between the 3% cap and exemptions. So basically, you could get an additional 5% increase on the grounds of exemptions as long as you submitted a form around that. Ultimately, the city was tasked with reviewing those. I think 86% of the self-certifications were ultimately approved. And we did have people who raised their entire portfolio rents, then not just by the 3%, but by 8%, because they self-certified their whole portfolio. Now, there are challenges to that, but that's part of how that played out for us initially. And we did see how much they slowed down is debated by different people and different sources of data, but according to HUD data, permits went down year over year, 48% in that first year for new buildings. And we had some major developments that the developers chose to just pause altogether while this got sorted. The revised policy made a number of changes. So it kept that 3% headline number, but it now has a 20-year exemption for new construction. It also exempts affordable housing. I know there was a question in the chat on that. I think the affordable housing exemption is an interesting conversation, because on the one hand, the reason for the exemption is there are already limits on how much affordable housing, protected subsidized housing can increase. And those are tracked at a metro level by the federal government. And so there's already a nuanced conversation there. So the sense of sort of that's already measured, why would we need to bother? On the other side, if affordable housing, where there are more protections, has determined that a higher increase is needed than the market gets, that also feels a little odd. So that year, so 2022, the area median income limits in the metro, and therefore the increases that made for affordability levels in our metro were 12%. And so affordable housing was actually authorized to make some pretty significant increases to rent. They didn't all do it, but they could. And St. Paul's cap sort of applied to that and restricted it. So it's kind of a weird question to me of whether or not affordable housing should be treated differently. They kept then the exemptions, the self-certification. You could request more than 8%, but that had additional burdens on documentation, and only about 20% of those were approved. A reasonable return has been further defined, and that is defined as whatever your base operating income, your net operating income minus expenses, in the first year, which was determined to be 2019, was plus inflation. And so they didn't use the 12% standard. It's even more complicated than that, but it is sort of definable. Decontrol. So decontrol, what they did is said there isn't complete decontrol, but when you flip a unit, you can in that year increase rents 8% plus inflation. So inflation is very high right now. There are a lot of increases, applications for 15% increases this year in St. Paul. Now, someone had asked in the chat, how are there concerns about quality and sort of buildings deteriorating? This sort of decontrol is an attempt to say, like, here's when you should make these improvements when the unit is vacant, and we'll acknowledge that you can increase rents more to cover that. In order to monitor that in the way that Tina talked about around making sure there isn't an incentive to kick people out, if you are applying to do that decontrol rent increase of 8% plus inflation, you have to submit paperwork that says this is why the tenant left. And if you are the one that chose not to renew their lease, it has to be attributed to one of a set number of factors that are considered to be just or fair reasons, like lack of payment, to not renew a lease. So that is, we'll see how the governance of that works, but that's the current sort of compromise and structure of the system. That I put in there, it's $635,000 and 5 employees is the current budget allocation to administer that system. So again, these all intersect and overlap in interesting ways. The 3% is not at all the full story, because the policy feels very different now than it did before. And some people are very relieved by that, and other people are like, what is the point of what we just passed if this is what it looks like now? So you get all of the reactions to it.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
And someone asked about,
oh yeah,
NOI, that's net operating income. That is basically your income minus expenses for a specific building.
Great. And there are a couple other considerations. How we're doing on time. We'll try to kind of zoom through these so we have enough time for discussion. One concern is that landlords may convert to condos in order to not have to be subject to rent control regulation. And there has been research to show that this does happen after cities or counties institute rent regulations. So for instance, in San Francisco, rent stabilization was associated with mass condo conversions, and apartment buildings under rent stabilization were 10% more likely to be converted to condos than non-controlled buildings. So in response, San Francisco has limited condo conversions to 250 annually, but property owners still find ways to work around the policy. We heard somebody told us the way in which they convert properties in cities like San Francisco is to hold property as tenancy in common. So 6 people will buy a building together, and each will have their own agreements and occupy different units. So they're technically not condos, but they operate like them. So that's just another concern, and thinking about, you can, in some ways, the way you design the base policy can create these misaligned incentives. You can try to add on things to try to get around it, like more limits to condos, but it might be better to just kind of try to set the base policy at a rate that doesn't incentivize condo conversions in the first place. So thinking about how you want to design the base components of it, and then the add-ons to try to counteract some of the unintended effects is important. And other jurisdictions have passed reforms to address such policy loopholes and prevent decontrol or loss of additional units. So for instance, Mountain View, California, they have an ordinance that prevents condo conversions until the city has a certain number of apartments in the housing stock. Cambridge, Massachusetts, conversion applications must be submitted 3 years ahead of time. And in San Jose, California, selling a property does not trigger any change in rent stabilization, and demolition is the only way a landlord can remove a property. We already talked about this a bit, but impact on new construction. So we really already went over this, but just to reiterate, while older regulations did not include new construction as part of rent stabilization, newer policies do or have a shorter period of exemption for new construction. And most of the research on rent stabilization was conducted on those older policies. So we really don't know what impact these newer policies will have, but there's considerable reason to believe that it could have a negative impact on new construction, depending on how it's designed. Stephanie, jump in anytime, because I'm just going to kind of zoom through these. But so what about means testing? I like to tell a personal story here. So when I first moved to DC 10 years ago, with my now husband, we moved into an apartment. I had no idea it was rent controlled. And I personally would not be the target audience if I were designing a policy meant to, maintain affordability. So one, I was in a rent controlled unit, and two, we were getting these heating bills each month that were like $800, and we were in a 1-bedroom apartment surrounded on all sides, 3 sides by other apartments. There's no reason our unit should have been getting those bills. And the landlord, we repeatedly went to the landlord, to the utility company, and no one would fix this until we eventually moved out. And so I talk about that as that was an informal way that our landlord got us to leave on our own, right, without evicting us. So, but on the means testing side, most rent control regulations, and in fact, I don't know of any that require means testing, meaning that somebody has to be below a certain income level in order to be in a rent controlled unit. So most of the tenant organizers we talked to said they don't like the idea of adding means testing to rent control because affordable housing is a human right? And what they say is means testing isn't the issue. Everybody needs low cost housing if you want a better society. If you use means testing, then what happens to people who are middle income and they just lose their jobs? We want to make housing less of a commodity and more of a community asset. Or we're not going to have stable communities. We don't have communities because people can't stay where they are. So this issue of means testing, on the one hand, means testing could better target rent controlled units to people of lower incomes. And because of our history in the US, that people of color are more likely to have lower incomes. So that would also be a racial equity way of better targeting it. But, bureaucracy and administrative costs of doing means testing for this would be quite large. And it takes away from that broad application of rent stabilization as a consumer protection policy that encourages neighborhood stability.
I think part of that goes back to this question about what are different policies for. And I would say that this is a policy that is about managing rapid increases and transitions in community. It does not and cannot solve affordability challenges or issues that are wages are too low, right? And so you have to work within the bounds of what a policy can and cannot achieve. I'm just speaking my own voice here. I think means testing sounds great, but in practice is probably more trouble than it's worth. And there are other really great strategies for directing money.
Yeah, it's a great point. And somebody in the chat asked about this. So what about incentivized rent stabilization? So not requiring it or requiring it, but having some sort of incentive or tax break for the landlord. So tax exemptions are sometimes used to add units in recently constructed buildings to the controlled stock. This can help mitigate those negative supply effects, right? If it's voluntary, landlords choose to opt into rent control because they get a tax break, then you're not going to have that negative impact on overall supply. However, it can be overly generous and what tenant organizers called a monumental giveaway to developers, right? As rents are still initially set at market rates. So an example, the Affordable New York program 421A provides developers with a subsidy to place their units under rent regulation. And their J51 exemption and abatement program subsidizes renovations or conversions of industrial or commercial spaces into apartments under the condition that the building remains stabilized for 20 years. And rent stabilization provisions can also be placed temporarily on buildings that were developed using other tax credits or exemptions, but are transitioning to market rates. So I know this gets into that question of are subsidized units subject to rent stabilization. Some places have used rent stabilization after those units have become unsubsidized to ensure that they don't just pop up, right, to really unaffordable rates. There we go. So pass it over to
Yeah,
you.
so this is a policy that predated the rent control conversation, though not by a lot in Minnesota. I don't know enough about taxes in Maryland to know how well this translates, but I think it's an interesting model. And basically in Minnesota, affordable housing has a different property tax rate than market rate housing. So affordable, again, meaning anything that has a deed restriction on it, where public money meant that there was meant the housing was only available to certain income levels. And what this did is it allowed older buildings, generally sort of smaller, older apartment buildings like the ones you see in the photos, that were not originally built as affordable housing, but their rent levels were below the levels that would qualify you to be affordable. Sorry, there's a lot of linguistic semantics in that, that you could apply to get access to that tax classification. And so the city would give you a small amount, I think it's like $100 per unit, so that qualified you as receiving public money in exchange for affordability, and then you got access to this tax classification. And in exchange, your current tenant, no matter what their income was, could stay. But for any new tenants that they needed to make below 60% of sort of average incomes in the metro, and you promised not to increase rents, not to go more than 6% a year in increases, and to make sure that they stayed below the defined levels for what someone at that income could afford. It gave you access to other incentives, and it had a pretty simple compliance process. So you basically just submitted a spreadsheet to the city every year that said, here's the unit and here's what it is. So it wasn't that much of a burden on property owners, and small property owners were able to do this. You could actually do this if you had a duplex and rented out one half of it. You could keep that at the level and get a 40% tax reduction on that single unit. It started with just under 800 units, but now just 4 years later, it's in 5 cities and it's 12,000 units. So this achieved a level of rent stabilization in targeted properties, and it was an incentivized and voluntary system. I think an interesting model.
Super interesting. And these are really, yeah, kind of some of the newer approaches that are being explored and experimented with. Just other cost benefits and summarizing some of what we've talked about. The potential costs are that rent stabilization could reduce the overall rental stock, potentially harming people who are not lucky enough to be in a rent controlled unit. But some other benefits that we heard that are less easy to quantify, right, are that rent stabilization can help build social ties through stability, right? Renters in regulated units may build stronger social networks, tenant associations, and unions. They may also be more likely than renters in unregulated units to challenge landlord harassment and insist on unit repairs. And stabilization helps to mitigate landlord-tenant power imbalances and gives tenant needed social supports. One advocate said, rent control has made a key difference in challenging the power imbalances, not only between tenants and landlords, but also in increasing civic engagement. So how might a place go about designing the right rent stabilization regulation, right? So if a place does decide to enact rent stabilization, they should really think carefully about all of these policy decisions to make sure that it preserves affordability for stabilized renters while not harming the overall supply of housing, right? And like Stephanie mentioned, this is not a solution to all of our housing problems, right? It is not going to address our underlying supply problems that we have in this nation. We have an undersupply of housing, right? So these should always be paired with direct investments in affordable housing and land use reforms that remove exclusionary restrictions and address supply constraints, such as increasing height allowances, removing parking minimums, and simplifying the development process. This last one is something that does not get talked about enough, right? The development process is so important, and how hard or easy it is for someone to develop a new unit or to rehab an older unit is just so important, right? And we talked to one small contractor who I think just said it so well. He said, 40 years ago, when I first started being a building contractor, I could walk into the county building with a plan that was basically 3 pages. I would walk out with a permit and it would cost me about $200 in 1 hour. Now it would take you probably at least 4 to 6 months to get a permit, which would cost you $30,000. That's a huge difference, right? And so really thinking about the processes and the fees and what other barriers there are to supply in your county while at the same time thinking of stabilizing rent for those who need it now is super important. And then Stephanie, anything to add on that broader idea?
This is just another resource. Like I said, we've been going through our own process, and ULI and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis partnered to do a four-part series that was not unlike what you guys are doing right now. So if anyone really wants to go deep, there is a written summary and links to those 4 recorded videos that went into all of these. And we were really trying to approach that from a it's not that rent control is good or bad. It matters how it's designed. And so let's talk about those details. So it's just available as a resource.
Yes, and similar, we'll share this PowerPoint, but we also have a paper on our qualitative research on this, and we are finishing up a larger study that is looking using data to look at the impact of rent control on affordability and access to opportunity for people of color and people with low incomes throughout the US, which will be available in probably about 6 months. So should we open it up to questions?
Yeah, and I'm going to give the first question to Shola Giwa from NHT and also serving on our work group, because I see in the chat she was having trouble putting something into Q&A. While she tries to come off mute and turn her camera on, I'll just say, thank you guys for laying this information out for us in such a clear and productive way. I know it's a lot of information for folks. Again, this recording is going to be available. We'll make the presentation available, and we hope folks will also dig into the other resources that you all have outlined. And I'll say that the thing that is most impactful for me is just, sort of realizing that we're not going to serve all of our affordable housing problems in the county with this policy, that it is our job as county officials to push forward that comprehensive conversation about affordable housing that we've needed to have for a long time. And this is one tool in the toolbox, but certainly not comprehensive. So Shola, I don't.
So actually, I was asking for a friend about how to add a question to the Q&A session, but I think that the questions I had have been addressed in the presentation already. So I will just say thank you for putting such a comprehensive presentation together. And we look forward to the other 2 sessions.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you. I see Councilmember Oriato is trying to say something. And Councilmember, I'm going to try, and I tried before to elevate you as a panelist. You're in the attendee list. So let me see if I can get you to the right place so you can say something. Here we go. Councilmember, you should be able to. Oh, there we go.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Just want to echo, thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I'm Councilor Orietta, and I'm going to have the pleasure of chairing this work group and move forward the temporary rent stabilization that we have now. And one of the things that you talked about that I noticed was a key issue, even with the temporary legislation, was that there's still ability to find loopholes to the legislation. And so just recommendations on what you've seen around, is it something where you just see that you have to just do the best you can passing something, and it's something that jurisdictions have to constantly revisit and make amendments to as things come up? And there's just hasn't been a full way of doing it, but that was the one concern that I had, because within probably less than a month of passing the legislation, had to go back and do an emergency piece of legislation to amend a loophole that some landlords were using.
Yeah, I'm sure Stephanie can speak to this as well. But one thing we've talked about in the past is that, you want to allow room for making changes as things arise. Better if you can learn from how those have happened in other places before and set those up right in the first place so that those loopholes don't exist. But if loopholes do arise that you didn't foresee, yes, it's good to be able to amend the legislation to reflect those, but you want to really be careful not to be amending too much or too soon, because that creates uncertainty in the market. And that can be sometimes even worse than having strict regulations, right? Uncertainty can in some ways be worse for landlords and for developers, right? So Stephanie, I don't know if you have thoughts there on more details of like timelines and things like that for allowing for reforms to it.
Yeah, I think that uncertainty point really matters. So in Minneapolis, so St. Paul passed a policy, changed their policy. Minneapolis, what happened was voters authorized the city council to consider a policy. The work group was convened. The work group recommended something pretty strict. The city staff recommended nothing, and it's politically incredibly polarized. And so that level of uncertainty and a sense that a policy could happen at any point or could look really strict means that there are landlords who are increasing rents now. Because someone had asked a clarifying question about these rent increases. Is it just based on what was paid last year? The answer is yes, typically. They might sort of retroactively look back and have the start date be a year or two ago, but there are always apartments that rented at the high end and apartments that rented at the low end, or homes. And so how affordable that stabilized rent is varies from building to building. Then the policy treats it consistently. And so in the midst of uncertainty, I see landlords increasing rents to get ahead of risk, and developers and investors pulling back because they're scared of it. So I don't think you want it to be completely open-ended. You should always be willing to learn, but a radical or rapid changes can just sort of confuse different market forces and actors in a way that probably isn't helpful. So it's a weird balance between respond but don't swing wildly. And I think people come at it from different perspectives on whether the best answer is to do something a little looser at the beginning and then potentially tighten if need be, or go tight and then pull out. Personally, I might say go a little looser first, because I often think part of this is driven by investors coming in and flipping individual buildings. So there are massive rent hikes, and that's something that we know it's possible to stop without all of these other consequences that we can't quite predict yet. And so that feels a little easier to make happen off the bat. Sorry, there's no easy answer. It's a really great question.
And then my last question, or second question, because I'll create space for other people to ask, and you might have talked about this and I missed it, but one of the things that has come up is the conversation of like defining rent. And I think you touched on it a little bit when you talked about like other high costs. Like one of the issues that's been brought to my attention is that some landlords have added like additional parking fees, or added like playground fees, or washer and dryer fees that weren't there before. And so there's this conversation around defining rent. Have you seen policies that have like a more broad sense of definition of rent?
Yeah, so yes, that will happen. Like one thing in particular is around utilities, and like in Minnesota, the way that works is if the building has a single meter, then that needs to be included in rent. If units are individually metered, then utilities can be charged on top of rent. And that can be really helpful for landlords because, it's not their business practice that changes energy costs, and energy costs are something we've seen fluctuate a lot lately, but that question of what is and isn't in rent is, you kind of have to write down what you include and not include, and there might be state statutes that are part of that as well. So like with affordable housing, there are always rules around whether or not parking can get included, and it depends on where the money came from. So to some extent that will happen, and you can't control all of that. And some of that is maybe a pressure release valve that can be useful, but if there are things you're already seeing, it's worth just writing in what is and isn't eligible for those increases. And there were lots of questions in the chat. I'll probably sort of mark them all as answered about this. How do you deal with the fact that different costs increase differently? And that's all about the details in your exemption policy and what is a fair rate of return and what can you pass through and what can you include and what is capped. And there isn't a single answer.
I want to invite some of our other work group members, for those work group members who have questions, to turn your cameras on, unmute yourselves, if you all have questions.
How you doing? I'm Carlos Lancaster.
Hey there.
Yes. My question is, and I saw you go through some of this during your presentation, but is any of the localities or areas segregated to different investors from we call mom and pop investors who may own a couple of units rather than someone who may own a 200 unit building? Was there any kind of separation in the middle of that, where it's like a declination line that's separated against certain rent caps or anything, or different rules for that?
Yes, I think if I understand your question, yeah, there are different places decide differently how they're going to try to keep exempt small mom and pop places from rent control regulations while keeping in the bigger landlords, right? And so some places do that based on the building size. But as research has shown, or as has happened, some bigger companies then will buy a bunch of smaller properties to be exempt from rent control, even though they have a big portfolio, right? And so some cities have started to say what's exempt or what's not exempt based on the size of and I already said this, sorry, so if this is not what you're asking, feel free to interrupt, but that based more on the portfolio of the landlord rather than the building itself. Yeah, Stephanie, other thoughts on?
Well, and I'll just say that gets further complicated because a lot of buildings are technically owned by different companies, right? So you'll set up like a different LLC as a property owner specific to that building, and that's because you don't want, you're managing risk, right? So that if something happens in one building, it doesn't impact your whole portfolio. But it's not as simple as Paul owns 5,000 units. Paul has a stake in, 27 different LLCs that own some range of those units. So it's just it's a great question, and it's a complicated thing to parse through. And like with everything, there are ways to work around it. And so I think an attempt to address workarounds, which will always happen, I think can lead to over designing systems in a way that means if you have the time, the money, and the lawyers to help you fully understand the system, you can still do the workaround. And if you don't, it gets even harder for you. And so sometimes simpler and clearer just works better.
And I understand that, and a lot of our clients were like, no, I'm not even talking about buildings. I mean, on like one condo, one townhouse. And those aren't normally the people who are trying to get around the system because they don't have the lawyers or whoever. And that's really, I'm trying to separate those type of mom and pop landlords or housing providers than the big guys who do have more lawyers and so forth to get around those certain rules that apply. So, okay, but that sounds good. I was trying to see if other places had to deal with that or how they dealt with the differences in housing providers.
Yeah, there's been a lot of different ways that people have tried to do exactly what you said. And some places just say, if you're an LLC, you're not exempt from rent control, like, so getting around that. So, but most places do try to exempt those mom and pop kind of landlords.
I'll ask you a question because I think that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A phrased in different ways that get at this issue of like the fear of disinvestment, like in a jurisdiction's housing stock overall. And I guess I'm wondering if there is any research out there that, you know, sort of explicitly links the two, because some of the more prominent and older examples of rent control or rent stabilization are in cities that have had, continue to have explosive housing markets. So I wonder what's the link between the two.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I'm going back to my paper to refresh my memory on what the research has said on that. Stephanie, I don't know if you know off the top of your head.
I think that is partly, that's where the decontrol conversation comes up and how it's treated now in different policies, because a lot of the older policies, some of them talked about DCs, was units before 1985. And so anything after 1985, which continues to be a greater and greater share of the housing, is not part of the policy. And others where you have decontrol, that means when a tenant changes over, there isn't a cap on how you increase rent. So it stabilizes the individual tenant experience. But if that tenant leaves, the unit adjusts to the market. And if the market is really high, because demand is really high, then it's going to go up. And so prices are still increasing. And that's where you can have, and we've seen in the research in the past, very different experiences where if you're in a rent controlled unit, it's great for you. If you're not in a rent controlled unit, it's even worse for you than it would have otherwise been, because there is some set of units that sort of they're kind of a hidden supply. And so it's increasing the pressure on the units when they do flip. And so the decontrol conversation is, and not having decontrol is part of an attempt to address that. It just comes with its own other set of challenges.
Yeah, and I'm remembering now looking at the research evidence on the quality issue. I think, again, the issue is that most of those studies were older and they were done on regulations that did not have some of these cost pass-throughs and some of the new ways that places have tried to address quality concerns. And so, some of the older regulations that didn't have those and were, stricter, I think there was some evidence of quality deterioration of units.
Mm-hmm.
But, there are ways to allow for that, for those improvements and get those benefits as well.
Another thing, and I don't know how your system works, but here we have tiered rental licensing, so that basically grievances against you will lower your tier. So a tier 1 landlord is not expected, or they're not subject to inspections as often, their fees aren't as high. And if you increase your evictions, if you have more issues with your property, code violations, then you drop down and your fees are higher and you get inspected more often. There might be a system, I don't know of one, or one that could be designed that linked those different policies so that you could self-certify rents, but only once. And if you tried to do it all the time, you go in a different classification level and different, subject to different levels of inspection. So there could be different ways to nuance by, frankly, documented reputation. So not just understood reputation, but
almost like
documented violations
insurance.
of a
Like the more you use it, the more expensive it is for you, or
Yeah, and we're all experimenting with some of these. Like, it isn't tested, but it seems to try and address And one of the benefits around that tiering system for us is it's public. And so as a renter, the landlord has to post what tier they're in when you walk into the unit. And you know, if you understand it, which is always a question, that a tier 3 landlord has probably had a host of past issues.
Shola, you have a question?
Question or just comment. When I listened to, Ms. Brown, there is, and I'm not sure if we are talking about not excluding affordable housing, but whether it's affordable housing or naturally occurring NOAA buildings, where because of the initial limits in funding, maybe the original rehab was not as robust as it should be. And so when you can't talk, because I know that this is an issue across the nation, that some affordable housing or just some naturally occurring affordable housing, where there is a need for capital infusion to upgrade and actually make sure that the property continues to be sustainable over the long term. Obviously, the impact on, whether you call it rent stabilization or this sort of, card sort of grading means, and, that affordable houses affordable houses or renters and owners, developers who are responsible in themselves, but are stuck in this thing where most of the funding is focused on delivering new units as opposed to improving and upgrading existing units. How do you compete in such a structure? Right? If you're building because you've had complaints and is, I don't know what is your grading system, 1 to 5 or ABC or whatever. Where is the room for something like that?
I mean, I think that is one of the fundamental challenges, right? Because the buildings that tend to be most affordable and therefore where the families who are low, moderate income are primarily living are older buildings, and older buildings eventually need to be repaired or they're just going to be broken and condemned buildings in the end. And so there has to be some system to get money and to upgrade those, but you don't want a system where somebody comes and upgrades a building, not for anyone who's in the community right now, but for the community they hope to be able to attract. And so that's just one of those tensions. And Tina mentioned sort of the concept of anti-gouging policies earlier, and that's where there's a high cap to try and stop you from flipping. I mean, I've told this story often, 2 doors down from me, the building sold and the landlords increased rent 60 to 80% per unit in 1 year. So, I mean, some of these really dramatic things happen. I think rent caps don't necessarily stop the increases, but they spread them out a little more. And so you've just got to figure out how to make enough allowances and exemptions in your policy that needed capital improvements can and do happen, but that they don't happen at the cost of displacing an entire building worth of families. And it's finding some of that middle ground. It's not a perfect answer, but I acknowledge the tension in the question. It's very real.
And I guess I would just add that it just reinforces to me that rent stabilization is just one tool in the pursuit of preserving affordable housing or making sure that housing is affordable to the whole community. And when I say affordable housing, I'm not necessarily talking about restricted housing as we're talking about it, just of housing that's affordable to everyone that lives in the community.
And to that point, and other policies, and I'll keep it short because I know we're almost out of time, but notice of sale requirements are something that we've passed locally so that tenants have to have a certain advance notice if their building is being put up for sale. And that gives more opportunity if it looks like you're going to have to relocate. And there are different jurisdictions that have put relocation assistance requirements when buildings are sold that rent below a certain level. And so that, you know, maybe you still can't stay because you can't afford even what are reasonable upgrades to the building, but that there are some supports that exist for you. So there's lots of different policies that serve different purposes.
Go ahead, Dolores.
Hello, I'm a senior and I'm asking this question. I live in a senior subsidized building. We are on fixed income. And what I'm trying to ascertain is how can we put into law a bill that can help the seniors whose rent is being raised from $400 to $800 in order that they can meet market rate when they're on fixed income. The income is not changing for them, but the market rate is because of the area in which that building is located. How can we have a bill or put up something in the bill that loophole, they won't have that loophole?
I think this is hard and kind of gets back to that bigger supply question. You know, if you put such a limit that it can't increase at all, then those landlords are going to leave, right? And so I think this gets back to that bigger supply question of why are rents rising so quickly? Is it because we have exclusionary zoning that restricts development and we don't have enough supply? And if so, we really also need to address that underlying supply issue. So, I mean, I think that's part of it. And Stephanie, I don't know if you have other thoughts on how, I don't think you can.
I guess if you could, because you talked a little bit before about that most of the policies in place in the country do exclude subsidized units that have affordability restrictions on them. But I do think there might be some nuance there in terms of like who bears the cost increase when like area median income goes up, which drives up the rent on subsidized units.
Right, and they exclude them from these policies because they are separately regulated.
Mm-hmm.
But when those, you know, it's all tied to what average incomes are in your area. And your area is defined at a metro level. So your neighborhood might not increase, but your region might. And that increases the incomes that then allows the even affordable units to increase their rents. And so it's its own system of some level of rent control, which is sort of why places have exempted it. But it doesn't mean there aren't rent increases. And sometimes, like what we saw in St. Paul last year, those rent increases could be larger than what the local policy is looking at. So there are still caps, they just work differently.
And if I could add something just for context here, because I know exactly the concern that Ms. Dolores is talking about. And I think part of that goes back to the flaw in the legislation originally, how we wrote it. And to Angie's point about when we talk about affordable housing, and initially it was broader than focusing on subsidized housing, which the emergency bill changed. And I spoke with the management company, Ms. Dolores. It is flat at 3% now because of the change in the legislation. So they will be moving forward with the temporary rent stabilization at 3%. And so that has been rectified. I just wanted to clarify that. And that's the importance of how you write a bill, what's included and what's not included.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, council members. So we are at time. Again, Tina and Stephanie, thank you so much for plugging in with us. Tina, I know you're probably going to continue to plug in with us as we move through this process. There are many questions in the Q&A that I know we didn't get to, but as I said, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. We have a lot to consider. I think the conversation today has sort of laid out some helpful buckets for how we might pursue this conversation as we go forward. We will be looking for the work group to convene officially, as I said, around the end of July. Our intention at this point is for the work groups, the main meetings of the work group to be public. And so the public will continue to get to watch our process as we move along. And I think we are also planning for a couple of public sessions during our process so that we can have more of a, I guess you would call it more of a town hall style, so that the public can actually engage and ask questions directly or comment directly. We'll plan for some engagements that look like that over the next year as well. But with that, we are going to end for the day. This is being recorded. It will be posted to our county website. And I think as a result of your registrations, we have all of your emails. And so we will communicate with you that way as well. Thank you, everyone.